I'm Cecily O'Neill. I was an English teacher and a librarian partly, which was very quiet, very nice. And then I was invited on some courses run by Gavin Bolton and then by Dorothy Heathcote. And somehow just English and the library I was not so interesting anymore. And of course, I was particularly struck by teaching in role. I thought, fantastic, because I was not always in command of the class, even teaching English. And suddenly, if I was in role, then I would have so much power. And it never worked out like that. I figured out that that wasn't my style. But however, I went on trying to figure out what that particular strategy gave me as a teacher. And I think you're all English students. And do any of you try working in role in your classes?
They're English and drama. They teach English
English and drama. And again,
Perfect.
That's what I ended up doing. You have given it a try, being in role?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not so yet.
Planning to.
Yeah.
Kitty did last week, she said.
Yeah.
You did? Right. How did it work?
I think she was. What play was she doing?
I think it was one of the Henry.
Yes.
Shakespeare's Henry.
And she pretended to be a king, but I think all her students ended up thinking she was Princess Diana instead.
It was a
It's the tiara in the head. She has short blonde hair, so I think they were like.
I always started off as the king or, the prison governor or whatever. And very often they found a way to send me out of the room and I would be standing outside the drama hall wondering what I'd say to the deputy head if she came along. And then I realized that wasn't quite my style. And I'm still figuring that out. But I have found that the more, intellectual the group, or the more they're concentrating on their exams, the more they think that doing something like drama is actually going to be wasting their time. And of course it isn't. So if I was working on any of these wonderful texts, that you've got, that you're working on, you might have to find a way to make it seem very, very purposeful. But basically, if you're going to work in role, you're inviting somebody to step, or at least take a little tiny baby step across from the classroom reality into something that is just has touch of theatre life. Now that's sort of with younger children. It's sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. So it depends on the group. But with older ones, I think I would make it, to begin with, a very intellectual activity, if that's their attitude. For example, maybe if you're doing something complicated like Great Expectations, what do you think are the most important moments in the book? Because you're going to have to know that for your exam. I'll give you a test later. Can you find me, the 6 key moments in that text, or indeed any of these? So you've told me these are what they are. Can you imagine that if you were asked to produce an illustrated version of, let's say, Great Expectations, what pictures would you advise the publisher to include? You think it should be Miss Havisham? So have I got the right?
Yes.
Okay, Miss Havisham's dining table with Miss Havisham in it. Yeah, I'm kind of. Yeah. Do you think you could in effect, do a tableau. And that would be, get them out of their blooming chairs, just even for a moment. So that kind of, there are ways to do sort of baby steps. If somebody says that, the Christmas Carol is an important story, can you explain to me why it is and why is it so popular? Can you tell me in 50 words why that book is important? It has been countlessly, done as film and theatre and you name it. What is it about that? So they're beginning to think about the features of the book. So those are just ways you might sneak in. But basically, if you're working in role, it's a kind of invitation. And sometimes it's a provocation, a very mild one, if you have the sort of students we were just thinking about. But basically, it's doing what theatre does. It's saying, who is here? So if I start in a role, whether it's as a publisher or whatever, or maybe something more interesting, what's going on? And in a way, the group has to deduce what's going on. If I were to begin to say, I'm going to come in role, and I'm going to be a very, very important person, and I'm going to, that's neither theatre nor teacher in role. That's, of course, the minute I say that, I can see that there are ways that you might get around that. But basically, when you go to the theatre, people come on and start doing stuff. And you have to, they don't say, hang on a minute, I'm going to tell you I'm going to do now, because I am, a soldier on the battlement, and you'll be seeing Hamlet in a minute, but he's just backstage. It doesn't work like that. You have to kind of begin. So I'm really delighted that so many of you have responded to the advertisement that you saw in the local Dunsinane news. It's wonderful to be able to offer you these opportunities, because we know times are hard in Scotland at the moment, and it's lovely that so many local young people are looking for work. And there are many opportunities, because the minute Hotel Dunsinane is open, you'll all have satisfying full-time jobs. And I know many of you will, have lived in the neighbourhood for a long time, and it's possible that some of you may know quite a bit about the castle. Is that right? Because it's a very historic place, isn't it? Yes, and you know all about it, I guess. Have you ever been in there?
I haven't actually ever been in the castle, but I have heard lots of stories about it though.
Oh, you have?
Yeah. Well, I know there's a lot of history with kings, I think.
That's right. Yes, I think so.
Maybe there was a battle. But it's all just rumours that you hear growing up around here, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. It's very quiet around here, isn't it? There's not much going on. But I think once the castle is completely refurbished.
Yeah, but there's a blood problem.
What?
The problem with the blood on the walls. It's a problem.
Honestly, there's so many legends. That's one of the wonderful things about it, that all have to be taken care of. But it's we're looking for people like, obviously, cleaners, but there'll be people on reception welcoming the hotel guests. There'll be chambermaids. There'll be people in the stables, because it's wonderful riding. People come on these wonderful riding holidays, we hope. So there'll be money put into that. And and the entertainment of all kinds, of music playing. If some of you are gifted in that way, that would be lovely. And, we'll have entertainment of various
Well, like banquet kind of things.
Well, they certainly need cooks, and maybe on special occasions there might be a banquet, but
With a, like a theme, themed like ghost.
you've been listening to, you know, your grandma or something, or no, you don't. Well, I mean, it's, you know, and maybe that's part of the charm. People like that old stuff, don't they? Okay, I'll stop. But you can, I mean, you can actually see, of course, the possibilities, especially when I offer you a free weekend there before we open up properly. You know, so it'll be just you. It'll be lovely. There will be blood. So, yeah, so it didn't take long for you to work out who I was and what was going on. But yeah, so the advantages, I think, of working in role are many. I mean, there's it brings the group together. And keeping the group together is important. People are looking at the teacher rather than us. You know, will you stand up and tell us all you know about? Or you know, engagement is always voluntary. And the nice thing about keeping the group together is you can hide in the group. And if you're sitting there thinking, I've never heard such nonsense in all my life, that's fine. And a protection for the teacher as well. You know, if they say, you have to deal with, you know, Dorothy had wonderful ways of coping with people who were inclined not to go along with the pretend. You know, or people who wanted to join in, but it was inappropriate, you know, so the wonderful examples of the sort of stuff she did. But it's, I think it's much of what Chris was saying there, you know, that it actually empowers the group, and there's no, you know, if you suddenly said, you know, there'll be racing cars in you know, or something that didn't fit in, there's no blame particularly. I think that's a wonderful idea because there's a really open space and they could have almost, you know, so again, you can protect the kids as well as yourself, which is very important. So I think it's a question of trusting your own creativity as well. And if the class is bemused by what you're doing, you can say, you can check that out and say, who was that person? And what were they offering? Did you, you know, so if they say, she clearly lost her mind. But I think sometimes the kind of fascination of just seeing where it can go, where it might go, what you might be able to offer. Though it may take a long time for everybody to buy into it. So I don't know if there's anything you want to ask particularly or pick up on.
We did Dartford Manor Haunted House. We did it last week as part of thinking about the history. As we were saying in the session before, we were talking about how important it is to teach about the history of drama in education.
Yeah.
And there were quite a few people who said that in their departments this stream of work is taught in some way. Yeah. So I like that what you just did was to take that model because it's such a useful model.
And then
think, oh, you can put it to Macbeth. You can, the whole idea of you know, you have an invitation. There's an advertisement. How will we respond? Do we trust this person?
It's exactly Haunted House. I'm glad you spotted it because it's exactly the same structure. An advertisement, an invitation, no, a kind of, not just an invitation, but saying, I'm glad you saw it. You know, you're not getting out of that when you actually saw it. And if necessary, it could be on a blackboard or something. What you know, or what have you heard, go back and talk to the locals.
Yeah.
You know, I should remember dramas, the haunted house, because if I think I had £1 for every time it's been done around the world, I wouldn't be sitting here in my own castle in Scotland. So there's a kind of, you know, there are structures you can use. It's not just entirely making it up as you go along. And actually, the haunted house, you know, when I stumbled on that, I really didn't have very much of a clue as to what I was doing. And the thing about the haunted house is the hardest bit is being in the haunted house, because it just, at that point, gets, you know, how do you make the haunted house real in a way that me offering you £100, I guess I'll be about £1,000 now, the rates have gone up. You know, there's a reality about me talking to you about it, but, you know, being in a spooky house when it's, you know, it's a Monday afternoon in the classroom. But having done it various places around the world, it's interesting what comes up, because in Canada, I think it was, if you use time shifts, you know, what next morning, what do people find? You know, dreams are another wonderful thing to, you know, when you're in the haunted house and you're supposed to stay awake, you fall asleep. What do you dream? Or afterwards, when you come out, you need psychiatric care. A lot of people thought that. And in one occasion, and it was in a girls' school, all the people who went, 9 months later, they gave birth. So it kind of morphed into science fiction.
Yeah.
You know, and it became the Midwich Cuckoos or something. Yeah. So, you know, really, everybody finds a different way out of it, which is ideal, because, you know, it stays, you know, if things don't stay fresh, if they become a scenario, you know, where there is no discovery, there's no surprises. I want to be as surprised as, you know, everybody else by what comes up. So, for example, with Macbeth, supposing, and you had the text, supposing you heard the whispers from the walls of all those, you know, blood will have blood, or, you know, those awful words that might be echoed around. Or supposing in, you know, the murder of Duncan, which we don't see, supposing we actually looked at the text very carefully and took all the descriptions of Lady Macbeth saying, you know, I have drugged them, and you know, they, and if he hadn't looked like my father, I'd have killed him, which is an interesting thing to say. And then coming back, and then Macbeth does the deed, but we don't see it. He comes back with the knives, and then she has to take the knives and go back and cover them with blood. So supposing you had the words, but you also saw what was happening. I don't know. You certainly know the text by the end of it. So, where have we got to? So, teacher in role, it's so different to what Chris was showing us, and yet that is again such a wonderful thing to do, to use a person in a role where they are the kind of catalyst for the sort of enlightened witnessing, which wonderful phrase that Chris used, And Steve, you said you used it in Norway with
Yes,
a colleague.
we do in ordinary kindergarten, but we are again talking way back in time. I think this was 1998. I did Dorothy's role, and my colleague Kari Hegstad was Albertine, but we based it on that idea, and but it worked very well, you know, in interaction with the children in that kindergarten. We were in their room, and isn't that the problem? And they really worked hard at it.
Yeah. Because these children had understood the parameters of their world, and then their world was interrupted by the appearance of Albert. But the other really, I think, key thing, and that I think is true in whether you use role as Chris did, or the way I've been talking about, is the absolute necessity to place the group in a position of influence or responsibility. You know, and I think that was my problem when I first started. I was the person with the authority and the responsibility and the influence, and nobody else shared in that, and I just bossed everybody about as best I could, not always successfully. But if it's somehow your fault or your responsibility to undertake whatever it is, refurbishing the castle or making it appropriate, then I might not say it was directly your responsibility, but it would end up being that. So with younger children, and again, you don't always have to begin in role. If you can begin by telling a story. You know, once upon a time, there was a group. I'll use an example. You know, there were a group of a village, and it was famous, this village, because everybody, all the people who lived there, were very, very helpful. And people used to come from miles around and ask for their help. And usually, in almost every case, these people were able to come up with very helpful suggestions and ideas. Do you think you could imagine that you were those people who were very, very helpful? Of course, you couldn't turn that up or down, could you? So, and maybe you might remember some of the wonderful, helpful things you've done. And then, one evening, they looked up and they saw that along the road was coming a very, very old, and even older now person, was coming very slowly along the road. And eventually she came to the village and she sat down. And what do you think the people would have done if that happened? Well, they'd say, what do you want, can we help you? And so they did. So anyway, on that occasion, I was a very old, helpless person, and I had just been dismissed from the castle, where I had been a nurse to the princess, because the princess was asleep. Nobody could wake her up, and for some reason I got the blame. We tried to hide everything. You know, I shook her, I drinking cold water, everything couldn't wake her up. And eventually, it said, well, it's obvious, you know, you need a prince. Don't talk to me about princes. I'm sick, sore and tired. Every prince for miles around has been trying to wake her up, to no effect whatsoever. And they're all in the dungeon. And they said, well, I can't have been a proper prince. And I said, well, tell me about it. And so they turned around and they said, they said George should go up and see how whether he can wake her up. And I said, oh, well, you know, do you think George would be able to do that? And they said, oh yeah, he's a very good kisser. So it was, anyway, George, bless his heart. This was being watched by a number of teachers. So anyway, the kids just took over, and there were, you know, the table, the kind of classroom tables. So it turned out that three of the girls offered to be the princess. So we have 3 princesses. Poor George. And George was a very solemn lad. He was quite small, but high status, you know.
Of course.
You know, it was done with great solemnity, this whole thing. And kind of stood up, and he came to the first girl, and I had no idea what he was going to do. He went like this, and just pressed her in the middle, like that, and go, next girl, and they woke up. Mind you, some of them had to have more than one kiss. You know, the question, I had to kind of trust the kids while preventing myself from just laughing, because you couldn't. And but it was that business where I'd offered them the responsibility, and they'd certainly taken it. And you know, that sort of thing can happen, and that was really. I'm fond of that story, because I often wondered what was George like 20 years later. You know, might have been quite a nice young man. But the key thing is that it has to stop being your story and your play, and it has to belong to the group in some way, and it has to acquire, if it can, and you can help it to. It has to acquire some significance. You know, Chris was quoting John Dewey, who talked about significant experience. And I think not always, but at its best, I think drama in education can be a significant experience, and it can enlighten, it can enhance a text, it can bring a class together, it can provide a kind of insight both into what people themselves can do and into what drama and indeed theatre can do. Because I think in a way, the closer your work can come to obeying some of theatre's forms, you know, the more successful it's likely to be. So the less it's a skit or you know, an inconsequential piece of improv, you know, the better. If it can have something at its heart, it's a bit meaty, whether it's a fairy tale or a significant text, a little text. And the more you can use what theatre uses to draw people in, to invite them in, to make connections, the better. So, any remarks, response? I think actually interest is the best way of controlling behavior. If people aren't interested, or if they are displaying a lack of interest in order to show that, you're a really good student teacher. Who could have less status than that? It's tricky. The best way of managing behavior. What have people found is the best way of managing behavior? I mean, people, sorry? No, you're asking.
My students have said that they find it so much easier to manage behaviour in role than Canterbury. And actually, what the conclusion they eventually come to is that they don't actually manage the behaviour, the art form does. Because you dissolve that, them and us.
Yeah.
I'm the power structure, you are the students who've got to do as you're told. Heathcote's model dissolves that wall. It's a form of breaking a fourth wall in a different way of looking at the Stanislavski structure. And that disappears. You're all on the same side. You're all going off. You're all going to get stuck on a desert island or whatever it is. And whoops, you've bumped your head, and now man's in a mess, and you're low status, and they have to sort it out. And getting them to hold on to that frame is the key thing. But once they've got that, largely the drama manages the behaviour, and it's the behaviour you want because they're all in role, behaving as they would do in that situation, which is
the
kind
problem
of
is
what they're
when
after.
they refuse to go along with it, or where there's one or two who are determined to break, stop it happening. And I think you're absolutely right that if the interest is there and the frame is strong enough, but I think.
Can I just remind you of a workshop I did with you years and years ago, where two of them decided they weren't going to be very interested and they were going to escape. And you said, that'll be all right, that might happen, because they will see the drama going on. They will still be engaged as watching it as witnesses, and they will find ways of unescaping, which was the phrase you used. They had to unescape, and they came back as somebody else who wanted. And that decision making is fascinating in itself. It gives them a chance to shed a role that they've now changed their mind about. And all that is so difficult in a straightforward mainstream lesson, whereas a teacher enroll in a thing that can happen.
Of course, and it's hard to talk about in the abstract as we're doing here. So to answer your question, it's tricky in that way. But sometimes giving them a watching role or a critical role. So it might be possible to say, well, if you don't think that we're being convincing, why don't you just watch us and see if we get it right? Or if so you make them almost the the critics or the people the advisors, and then you might say, well, when we were just doing that bit, would anything what do you think would have made it more convincing? So you're either giving them a chance to escape, or you're giving them a task. And even if it is, you take this very important note to the library, get me this book from the library. But I watched Dorothy, and I might have quoted this in Birmingham, where they were all on a pirate ship or something. And I don't think it was a pirate ship, but they were all focusing on the captain had locked himself in the cabin, and they were all watching to see what was happening when he came out, and it was all very tense. And one little boy said, "Oh, I see a shark." It's like, shut up about the shark. I didn't say that. She said, well, you keep an eye on the shark. You watch the captain. Yes. But I also did hear her say when somebody was being obnoxious, she said, I am the captain of the ship, and I have power to keep you in during break. Which I think was a rare thing for her to say, because that must have been really irritating. Yeah, so yeah, there's in the abstract it's hard to describe, but and there are a couple of things I think to warn against in trying teacher enroll, and I think, and when I was working in America, I found that this happened, which was that the teachers thought if they dressed up, that they would be more convincing.
Yeah.
But of course, what happens is that then they're being watched not for the reasons that I'd spoken about earlier, but they're being watched because they're now in a different world to the kids. So if I come in dressed in as, you know, I don't know what, but the Queen, you know, then everybody else is I've taken away entirely the power. So the struggle with teacher enroll is to give away your power, really, to hand over as much as you can. Within about, I would say, I give myself about three activities, you know, to hope by then people will have got engaged. So something as simple as Tableau as a second activity is often very useful. And then actually, and that would require, you know, critiques. If people didn't want to be in it, you would say, well, do you want to direct it or do you want to help them be better? You know, so divide up the responsibility sometimes as a way to get more people more deeply in. And then if by the third activity, whatever that might be, if people are still not engaged, then I have to find some way of staying with the moment in some way, not necessarily enroll, but which will allow me to think very seriously about, is this a drama that is going to succeed? So it might be something to write something or draw something or make a map of something. Dorothy was always fond of maps. She loved maps. She loved visual representations of things. And I think that can be very useful as well, but you don't need to plan too far ahead. And sometimes if I have begun something in role, not necessarily on a text, but if I've begun something, often it's I might need, what do you think has gone on before we just had this meeting? You know, we just had a meeting about something or other. Why do you think that meeting was important? You know, and then also, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow, the way if you can use time as a way of structuring your drama, it really, really helps. So, and look at the way Shakespeare does it. The Tempest, you know, there's a moment of real action with the storm, and then we have a very, very long bit where we hear the whole, you know, the flashback. I mean, it's what it is in effect, isn't it? And Macbeth is the same. Or that thing about the battle, we don't necessarily see it, you know, the bloody captain, never see him again. And, you know, that's flashback, really. So if you're making a film of it, they probably would waste a lot of time. And Hamlet, you know, also, we have to hear what's been happening to make sense of what we're seeing. On the other hand, we see something that grabs us, whether it's the storm or whether it's the characters, you know, Hamlet is such an example of that, with the Bernardo and Marcellus, or whatever his name is. You never see them again. And what did they do? Atmosphere, ritual, a sense of doom. the witches, we do see them again. So all of those possibilities are there. So any responses, questions? Yes.
This might be quite a simple question, but if you're teaching English in Rome, how do you get around the logistics of a classroom setting? So chairs, table, obviously you can move them out the way, but that obviously wastes a lot of time. And
It absolutely does. I just, and there's so little space. It's sometimes you think, what dramas take place with a lot of people sitting down? And I can think of trials, for example. You know, there are the end of Romeo and Juliet. Some will be pardoned and some punished. Well, we're here to examine the case against Friar Lawrence. You know, what the heck was he up to? You know, so they're still sitting there. Lady Macbeth, a request has come in that Lady Macbeth should be buried within the churchyard in consecrated ground. Well, we know that's not going to happen for Macbeth. That would be impossible. But my learned friends here believe that she was merely persuaded by her husband to undertake all these horrid things. Like, she certainly was not involved in such a horrible thing as the murder of Macduff's family. Now, I know that my learned friends on this side of the house believe that she has a lot to answer for. So I would like you to consult your files and see who would like to speak on either side. So you're pretending, but you're pretending within a very tight structure, and you have to know your text. So again, that might be presented as a test. And again, I think it was Arthur Miller said that all drama is forensic. So there's an examination of what's happening. And it's true, I don't know DNA, it sounds good. But A Christmas Carol, lots of opportunities for finding out who is responsible, who is to blame. It's a big dramatic question. And I think all of those of you, certainly a view from the bridge and Inspector Falls, is precisely what that's about. So, yeah, it's just not all drama has to be standing up and dashing about. On the other hand, you might want to recreate a moment. If you can grab a bit of space at the front. The one kind of seat that I absolutely hate, which they love in America, is the student trap, you know, which is designed not to let anybody stand up or escape. They're awful. I hope you don't have them in schools.
We've got a big lecture hall down there.
Oh, awful. So if you can avoid the student trap, you know, then it's possible for people to stand up or to step forward, or you know, to you know, present your final case. So you can actually get them out of their chairs occasionally. It doesn't all have to be, you know, singing and dancing. So I guess we're kind of coming towards the end. But
can I just ask you one thing? I was thinking we did a little project last year with the English for Drama group, looking at Heathcote's role conventions and things they could do in English with them, which are like making maps and those kinds of finding discarded items belonging to a character, or those kinds of things that move you into an imaginative realm, but don't necessarily involve you doing anything too risky, even to take on the role. And then there's a difference between how you respond to the discarded objects, whether you respond in role or whether you just look at them, or whether you're looking at them through a role that you assume as inspectors or whatever. We explored some of those things, and for the and they tried them in English, and that was those smaller things that along the lines of what you were saying, like
Yeah.
making maps or
Yeah.
doing things that are around the text that still will take you into the imaginative world without leaving your seats necessarily.
Letters. Shakespeare loves letters.
Yeah, letters.
You know, Macbeth and Wordsworth. And yeah, so I think if you can put the kids somehow in, if they are people who have the right to ask questions, if they have that is, and indeed the responsibility, you know, if they're detectives, if they're doctors, if they're psychiatrists, if they're again doctors, like that, there's a doctor in there, more she needs the priest and the physician. I haven't got the quote right, but you know, so you know, she needs somebody to absolve her of her sins. You know, the journalists. There's a story here, and I'm afraid, you know, it's we have the map. We know what happened. We have a couple of objects, but and it's an important story. But I've been told, and I know you've done so much work on it, and I really appreciate all your investigations. But you can't run it, I'm afraid. It's, I've heard from upstairs. It won't be. It won't. I'd hoped it would have been front page news, you know. So sorry about that, but if I can have all your notes before you leave, and your phones. So you know, and it's no good blaming me, you know. Actually, I've got the sack. Not that I'm blaming you at all, but so yeah. So those people who should, you know, whose job it is to ask questions and to get answers, and then for you enrolled to say, "I'm sorry, we don't want to hear that." No, that is not the government current line. No, that didn't happen. It was something else entirely. So it's nice to set something up and then deny it, and that fetches us. So that's my advice. Thank you for reminding me of what I used to know.